Throughout history, great leaders have often been associated in art with a specific creature. A noble creature, a beautiful creature. Kings, pharaohs, and emperors are associated with this wonderful creature, this symbol of power and beauty, this noble beast, the horse. So, horses and their relatives. There are, in the genus Equus, a number of zebras, or zebras. Another group of equids, often known, for want of a better term, asses, and horses. So amongst all of these, the donkey and the domestic horse are domesticated. So there are many varieties of horse, and at one stage people were saying that there are two main breeds of horse, from which all others are mixed. And there's the hot blood Arabian and the cold blood Northern European. It turns out that this is wrong. The studies on early horse genetics show that they have all the genetic variability of all the horses. And so they're pretty much just changed over time as they've moved around. So the cave art with horses on is not actually where you expect it to be nowadays, but this is from the Upper Paleolithic, Pleistocene era. And so in that stage, it was where the steps were not quite where they are now. The north of here, of course, would be ice sheets. To get a good idea of where horses could be now, these are the steps in the present day. So sites with information about early horse domestication and this sort of thing are over this entire region. Now, in this region, people live with horses. They have lived with horses for quite a long time, it seems. In the Upper Paleolithic, the horses were the most common animal type that is depicted on the cave art. So they lived with them quite closely. At some time later, there is evidence for domestication of them. But horses have always had a very close association with humans. Rather like the dog, their social structure works very well. So it may have been at any time that some child just got on the back of an agreeable horse, and horses can be very agreeable, and rode it, and that became a thing. So evidence of domestication is mostly found at first in the presence of horse milk as lipid residues in pottery. And the earliest evidence for that seems to be in what is now the Ukraine. Actually, it's called just Ukraine nowadays, isn't it? The Botai culture, also very important, also has residues of horse milk in its pottery. It has evidence of corrals, enclosed areas filled with manure, high phosphate deposits, and also has evidence that they had put halters on their horses, on the teeth, where the bit goes. Here you see, they found evidence on the teeth, indicating that they were definitely haltering the horses. The Yamnaya culture certainly was very much related to horses and also wheels. The earliest wheel is actually found at the Ljubljana marshes, which is here, which is actually 3000 BC. It's not actually in the area that you'd expect the Yamnaya culture, but at this time they were expanding out from this region. The Yamnaya are associated with the beginnings of the Indo-European language and genetic groups, and they spread out from here, taking horses and wheels with them. And in fact, where this is actually on the way to what could have been another steppe-like area in the Po Valley. So it's very probable that the wheel was actually from a Yamnaya related group. The Sintashta people up here, named after the site of Sintashta, have the first evidence of chariots. They have chariot burials. So we have wheels before that, we have horses before that. These look like actual chariots, used for like chariots, not just little carts. And so people tend not to be buried with their cart, but they get buried with their chariot. It's, you know, it's got weapons in it and stuff. So these were probably not as fast as later chariots, but still quite fast. You need to have a certain amount of speed in anything that horses pull in these early periods. I'll tell you what changed a bit later on. So the Yamnaya, as I said, spread. They spread to wherever Indo-Europeans seemed to be, and what they seemed to do it on was horses and chariots. The Kara-Araxes culture, from the Kura and Araxes rivers basins of what is now Georgia, are often thought to have had chariots, and their spread has been attributed to chariot warfare and the introduction of chariots. Later on, we definitely have major chariot-using cultures. We have the Hyksos, who are attributed to bringing chariots into Egypt. We have the Hittites, a big chariot-driving group. And the Indo-Aryans, the people bringing the Indo-European language into India, came into India at about this time. So chariots seem to be associated with the spread of the language group. So when the Hyksos came, they came and conquered Egypt. This unfortunate chap was one of the rulers of a, shall we say, more indigenous political group in southern Egypt, while the Hyksos ruled most of Egypt from the north of Egypt. And his name is Seqenenre Tao, and he actually was the father or possibly grandfather of the first, shall we say, indigenous pharaoh to rule Egypt again after the Hyksos. But as you can see, things didn't turn out well for him because he died presumably in a battle. He's got a wound at the back of his neck from a point, possibly a spear or possibly even an arrow. He also has these rather nasty wounds, which are probably from an axe, the sort of axe introduced into Egypt also by the Hyksos. Axes seem to be something that came from Eurasia, not from Africa. The indigenous peoples like to hit people over the head with maces, not with axes. Axes probably come from a lot more exposure to trees. And there were also this rather massive wound to his head from an axe rather like this, it seems. This is actually the axe of his son or grandson, Ahmose. And also someone caved in the front of his face with a mace head. So things didn't end very well for him. This may have actually even been in a chariot battle, as the Egyptians learned how to fight on chariots from the Hyksos and turned around and used it against them. Although there has been some suggestion that these leaders, even of the southern group, also had some Hyksos blood in them. But, you know, this isn't an Egyptology course, so let's not worry about it. So clearly the Egyptians did get into chariots in a big way. Here is a very well-known image of Ramses II on his chariot. The Battle of Kadesh in 1274 is one of the great chariot battles, if not the great chariot battle of history, in which Ramses says he beat the Hittites. It seems very convincing because he put up buildings with carvings on it, and here you can see there he is personally driving the Hittites into the river Orontes. And so it's obviously a very convincing battle, but somehow the political boundaries of the time didn't change, so it couldn't have been that convincing a battle. So chariots would have continued for some time. Later chariots are probably heavier, and even as late as the 6th century AD, when we first seem to have evidence of the prototype of chess, we have the use of the rook. The rook is actually Persian for chariot, or the castle. And so this attacks by charging forward. Whether the chariots of Ramesses' day, which were quite light and very fast, charged directly at people like that, even though that's certainly how they're depicted when Ramesses is sitting on them or standing on them, this may actually be how chariots were used by the 6th century AD in conjunction with elephants. This is an elephant. So chariots become the thing, very big thing. One aspect of chariots is this is actually before people worked out how to get horses to pull heavy drafts. And so this rather interesting image shows you quite clearly the distinction between the use of horses to pull very fast little wagons and oxen to pull very slow, heavily laden wagons, because it's quite easy to harness an ox and get it to pull a wagon, well, if it's domesticated, not if it's like, you know, a wild one. And it's fine with that, and it'll pull against that. But if you put a harness like that on a horse, you'll kill it. It'll cave in its chest. It won't like it at all. And so only something lightly attached and very fast to keep up with their speed would work with horses. That's until the Middle Ages. And in Europe, they invented the horse collar. So here you can see the horse collar. And so this goes over the horse and enables the force of the animal to pull a heavy load, like a plow or a big wagon, without it choking it to death. And so you do not see collars like this before the Middle Ages. So back to the steppes, where they have horses, and of course where they not only did chariots, but they also did let's just ride around the horses and annoy people. So a bit later on we have the Scythian cultures. The Scythians themselves are what the Greeks called the people to the west of here. There were some other related peoples, again Indo-Europeans it seems, and they're quite widespread. This and like to ride on horses. A related people, the Sarmatians, would carry their traditions on a bit later. The Sarmatians lived around here. So this is a Scythian, and I particularly like this image because she looks quite happy, having a good laugh and shooting her bow. The Scythians, of course, are known particularly for the importance of women. We have a lot of evidence that women were found with weapons, and so, yes, this image of a warrior Scythian woman seems quite legitimate. This is how Scythians tend to depict themselves. I actually don't know of any contemporary depiction of a woman warrior. This one presumably is not, because of the big hairy moustache. This is a Paseric Scythian from out in Siberia, of course. So the introduction of cavalry as a main method of warfare into the rest of the world, specifically the Middle East, the subject of this course, we actually have better evidence from the Neo-Assyrians, not because they were inventing it, but because they were depicting it very nicely. And in fact, at this time, they were having to deal with Scythian-related peoples who were invading from the north and making life very difficult for them. And so they thought they'd give this a go, and they got on horses. And so at first they weren't very good at it, and they needed actually somebody else to lead the horse while they shot things from it and that sort of thing. And they're also sitting very far back on the horse quite often. So it's not for, this is like 865, 860 or so. It's not for 200 years later than that. Oh yeah, we're zooming in, isn't that nice? 200 years later than that, we have, and here we have Ashurbanipal himself riding a horse quite properly. Presumably he actually did know what he's doing, and here he is shooting a bow. However, he doesn't seem to carry his own arrows, so he needs someone else to do that. But, of course, the contemporary steppe peoples will be able to do all of this themselves. They're brought up to it, and they're probably still much better cavalry people than the Assyrians ever were. But the Assyrians had other things up their sleeves. So the Romans were into cavalry, not in a big way. They didn't really like horses. If you know anything about the social structure of the original Romans, you will know that the elite, the social elite of the Romans, were called equestrians, were called horse riders. So they must have had some doings with horses, but they became quite rapidly, the Romans, to rely on infantry warfare. However, they also did start doing cavalry. They got the Gauls to do it a lot. The Gauls from France rather liked horses and riding around, and a lot of them became the auxiliary cavalry for the Romans. And one of the things the Romans we have, the earliest evidence seems to be in the Roman period, are very firm saddles. Having a saddle with a stiff frame, and there's some debate whether this actually is used on a saddle of that nature. We seem to have the earliest evidence of this period. They do seem to show up elsewhere in the world, but at about the same time. So where they really started, and it's probably just another one of these things. Probably the steppe peoples knew all about having stiff saddles, which enabled you to stay on the saddle a bit more easily and less likely to be knocked off. But they didn't use them very often. So what the heavy saddle enabled was heavily armored warriors on horses. This is an early depiction from Dura Europos, which, if you remember, was destroyed in the mid-3rd century, and is a graffito, or scratching on the wall, of what is called a clibinarius or cataphract, a very heavily armed horse with a very heavily armed individual on top. Here again, this is a much later one. This is one of the last Sasanian shahs, Khosrow Parviz, Khosrow II, and he is depicted as one of these very heavily armed warriors on a horse with a big spear, and his horse is armored too. So clearly having these heavily armed individuals seemed to be a thing. The next major development was the stirrup, of course. And here we have what happens when someone who's not particularly used to riding on horses is trying to do it without a stirrup. It doesn't work very well necessarily. A stirrup is a great thing for people that don't ride horses, for people who are brought up riding horses, or basically can ride on horses before they can even walk. A stirrup is largely pointless if you're just wandering around on horses all the time. So this is a Scythian. So he has something down here that some people said, this looks like it's the beginning of a stirrup. It looked like it would be a soft one, but rather than a stiff stirrup. But it may be that they had stirrups, although it could also be just something funny going on with his boot, because one thing you need with a stirrup is that other invention, a saddle. not just a blanket or a soft saddle, but a rigid saddle, because if you have a stirrup just going over onto a strap on the back of the horse really doesn't like it. Having your butt on it is fine, and a bit of pressure on the side, they can deal with that. But this nasty strap with all the weight of the individual on it would not be very nice if you didn't have a nice, big, firm saddle to be riding on as well. So you need both of these things to be going on before it starts to work. The Chinese, however, did have very nice saddles. Look at this big saddle here. You're not going to knock him off too easily. And to get onto his saddle, he has this, and this is a mounting stirrup. So it's actually a little later in China we get the first evidence for actual stirrups in the form of actual stirrups. It's quite useful. And so these stirrups, clearly, if developed in China, are because of the problems the Chinese are having with steppe peoples. Another thing they invented at the same time was a crossbow, which we should be discussing later on. It's a matter of, if you're dealing with horse peoples that learn how to shoot and learn how to ride before they can probably even walk and talk, you really need advantages like stirrups and crossbows. So practically identical stirrups are found a little bit later on the other end of Eurasia. This is like a couple of hundred years, which isn't very long to get from one end of Asia to the other. And so these are Avar stirrups. The Avars are another group of people that came from Central Asia and invaded Europe and settled in Hungary. In fact, this is actually in Hungary. And so you can see they're practically identical actually to those Chinese stirrups. Those stirrups became a thing with the big saddles. So this is a before big saddles and before stirrups thing. And you can see how here Alexander the Great is putting this spear into this unfortunate chap here, who's coming off of his horse. A nice blanket, not much of a saddle though. And so this is like an underarm thrust of his spear. You can also, of course, do an overarm thrust of your spear. However, what was then developed was a couched lance. And this is much later. In fact, the earliest depiction we have it is in the Bayeux Tapestry, which is either made in southern England or northern France after the actual Battle of Hastings in 1066, shortly thereafter. And you can see this chap on the black horse here has his lance under his arm as he's charging at this chap. And so you've got these other guys doing underarm, you've got other guys doing underarm, but this guy clearly has a couched lance. Here is another one. You can see this chap here, couched lance. And again, it's at that brutal bashing into your opponent. If you're just sort of coming up behind him and giving him a poke, the traditional technique still works pretty well. There's a lack of commitment there, just coming up, giving him a poke, and easily in a position to get away again. This chap is going straight in. He's going to stick the spear in him and knock him right over with his couched lance charge. So you're probably wondering, what's this got to do with the Middle East? Well, these people introduced it into the Middle East. In fact, this is thought by some people to be the advantage of the Crusaders over the local forces, is they were training a lot using the couched lance. They would work together as a group, and a combined couched lance charge was something you just could not actually deal with. And so the best thing you could do is actually get out of its way. And here you can see this is one of those clues. You can't see his stirrup, but you can see the way his foot sticks up like that. That's evidence that he must have had a stirrup here, and the stirrup would be up underneath here. And if you look over this again, you look at earlier images, their feet go down. And so foot up or foot down is one of the ways people see, was this person wearing a stirrup, whether there's a stirrup visible or not. Here you can see the same sort of thing, not quite so up, but the heel is down, you see, and he's wearing a stirrup. So this is how people used a lance in the Middle East. And they carried on using a lance in that way. They didn't change. What actually enabled the people of the Middle East to eventually defeat the Crusaders was actually horse archery. And since we have an entire lecture about archery later on, we'll talk about it then. So, on to other equids. Donkeys. Donkeys are quite simple. They are domesticated African wild ass, Equus africanus africanus, and the domestic species Equus asinus. And they can be found on wall paintings from 3rd millennium BC. So take a note of that, won't you? So here's a domestic donkey, classic lion-like tail, and very large ears. So that's how you know that this isn't a horse, or a bad depiction of a horse. Big ears and a tail with a tuft at the end. This is very useful for when you want to look at crosses between donkeys and horses, which is something that actually did happen. A mule. You might have heard of mules. A mule is a cross between a male donkey, known as a jackass technically, and a female horse or mare. A hinny is a female donkey called a jenny, and a male horse, which we refer to as being a stallion. So both of these are larger and more enduring and stronger than either of the parents, but they're usually sterile. So what seems to happen is that the front is like the father and the rear is like the mother. So here you can see in this photograph, it has a long hairy tail, like a horse, and big ears, like a donkey. So rear end like a horse, female horse, mule. This is a mule. So mules are particularly common in this sort of context. This looks like 19th century or early 20th century, I guess, North America. This is an interesting wall relief from Egypt. Here you can see what is obviously a horse. In fact, two horses, a brown one and a black one. And you can see the small ears, the big fluffy tail, the proud noble stance. And you have this thing. So this also has quite small ears. You see, this is not a donkey. It's got small ears. A donkey has big ears like this. But it has a donkey's tail. So with a donkey's rear end, that would make that a hinny. Try it out sometime. So the last equid that seems to have been domesticated is the Asian wild ass, also known as an onager, Equus hemionus. And this is depicted on the standard of Ur from the 26th century. It's called the standard of Ur. I don't know if it was a standard or not. And it's from, on one side, called the war panel, where they have all this war stuff going on. So here's this chart being drawn by these creatures. And if we do a close-up on that, you can see it actually does look like an onager. It certainly seems to be an ass of some sort. Although, of course, donkeys came from Africa at this time, so it's probably not an African ass, it's an Asian ass. Another thing that has been suggested is, in fact, it's a cross, because it has quite small ears, although it has an ass's tail. But, yes, Equus hemionus, the only evidence that we have domesticated it. Soon, of course, they'd have horses coming along, which are probably much easier to deal with. So, that concludes our account of the equids.